The Empire is all about the destruction of community in all of its forms. Tribal, cities, planets, organizations, faith, whatever it is. I don't think there's anything controversial about saying that. And that's finally, in the end, what the show is really screaming about.
This is Tony Gilroy, director, screenwriter, showrunner. Before Disney gave him $645 million to make 2 seasons of Andor, he was best known for writing the Bourne series, a trilogy of early 2000s spy films that dared to ask the question, what if being a spy sucks, actually? The Bourne movies were celebrated for taking a more realistic and gritty approach to the spy movie genre. Under Gilroy's writing, being a spy became less about ordering martinis and driving fancy cars, and more about trying not to get beat to death in a tiny European bathroom. This somewhat realistic approach to a modern spy story, amnesia plot aside, is what made these movies stand out. They aren't suave and sexy, but neither is real spy work. It's isolating and dangerous. Not just for the spy, but for everyone they care about. Each person you meet risks losing their life just by knowing you, and some do because of mistakes you make. Through his writing, Gilroy manages to make the situations his characters face, outlandish or not, feel tangible and realistic. He does this by peppering in many smaller details, otherwise overlooked by your average screenplay.
I can tell you the license plate numbers of all 6 cars outside. I can tell you that our waitress is left-handed and the guy sitting up at the counter weighs 215 pounds and knows how to handle himself. I know the best place to look for a gun is the cab of the gray truck outside. And at this altitude, I can run flat out for a half mile before my hands start shaking. Now, why would I know that?
It's these little details that allow an audience to accept a story as fantastical as a super spy with amnesia. Through them, there's a feeling that we are getting a little closer to the actual truth of what it means to work in espionage. Some people find these detail-rich but light-on-action scenes boring. These people have no taste. I love when good scripts do this. Use small, unimportant details not to move the plot forward, but to pull you into it, and to pull humanity from it.
Did you get the headaches?
Yeah.
I get such bad headaches.
You feel the toll this sort of work takes on a person's body and soul. Gilroy's approach makes characters and stories and dumb action movies richer in substance and space and time. This approach worked really well for the Bourne series, arguably so well that it changed the next 20 years of spy movies. Star Wars, I would argue, has been lacking in richness over the last decade, and is in need of its own change. But can Gilroy's human-first approach actually be made to fit a galaxy far, far away? I wasn't sure myself, so I avoided Andor for the last 3 years. It sounded like the sort of project that never actually comes out, and Star Wars has a lot of those. But it's hard to ignore a show this well liked, especially when it looks so damn good visually. This video is mostly about Gilroy and his team's writing, but I want to give a special shout out to Luke Hall, the production designer for Andor, whose work, alongside Industrial Light and Magic, is incredible. It's no wonder they made this guy an executive producer in Season 2. Despite staying for the writing, it was these visuals that first drew me in to finally watch the show. These handcrafted sets and real-world locations just feel so elite compared to the projects shot using Disney's volume technology. And it's a joy to watch actors move through worlds that feel tangible. If a movie or TV show is gonna cost hundreds of millions of dollars, the actors should be able to touch a countertop or fiddle with some space trinkets from time to time. Just assume that any scene I praise from this point forward is like 5% influenced by the feeling that I could pick something up in it. The props, sets, actors, and of course the writing have turned Andor into easily my favorite Star Wars project to come out maybe ever, certainly in my lifetime. In a rather shocking turn of events, it wasn't a flashy new sequel trilogy, or an Obi-Wan show, or an Ahsoka show, or whatever Skeleton Crew is, that finally landed Disney a critical darling. It was Andor, a show that, when it was announced, sounded like a project guaranteed to be cancelled before it ever saw the light of day. But somehow, Andor returned, and I miss it already.
That's just love. Nothing you can do about that.
Tony Gilroy's approach to storytelling, creating detail-rich, human-first narratives, takes a little while to get going. I think it's safe to say that Andor starts slow, but it also builds on the foundation laid out in its first 3 episodes in a way that Rogue One, a Star Wars story, never could. To be completely honest, Rogue One is a movie I watched once, in theaters, a decade ago. Don't get me wrong, it has some neat ideas, like how maybe rebelling against a galactic empire takes more than a plucky attitude and some space wizard parlor tricks, but it doesn't really have a ton of time to explore those ideas fully. Andor has that time, and uses it effectively.
And this was a 1,500-page epic novel about revolution, which was and fascism and rebellion and stuff that I'd been really excited about my whole life and didn't really have an opportunity to put anywhere, and this was it. And I had Diego Luna and a lot of Disney money and...
Nearly every scene, episode, and arc ties back to a few central questions that Gilroy's team wished to explore. How does an empire control a galaxy? How do you fight that empire? What does the fight cost you? Let's start with that first one, because it's a doozy. Andor takes place in one of the darkest periods in Star Wars. The Empire has risen, is ruling, and seems impossible to oppose. But this fictional dictatorship has to do 2 things at once narratively. They must feel powerful enough to be able to swiftly take over the galaxy, and also vulnerable enough to topple within a few decades. This is a complicated narrative beat in the overall Star Wars timeline. There's a reason this time period has been mostly yada-yada'd or covered by a show made for children, selling the Empire as a credible threat and also a force that normal everyday people can defeat within a few decades is a tall order. But Andor starts to show how this Empire operates and where their potential vulnerabilities lie in the very first episode. Before we are properly introduced to this Empire, we meet their subcontractors.
Have you modified your uniform?
Perhaps slightly. Pockets piping and some light tailoring.
The consolidated holdings of the Preox Morlana Corporation aren't exactly the kind of villains that strike fear in the hearts of potential rebels. They're middlemen, a corporation holding on to some minor political power by enforcing the Empire's rule on planets that, ultimately, don't interest said Empire very much. The fact that these guys are in charge at all tells you a few things. The Empire, despite having all the weapons and ships and legal authority to pretty much do whatever, seems to lack the manpower necessary to control every single podunk Outer Rim planet in the galaxy they now rule over. So they outsource that control to subcontractors who aren't exactly good at their jobs. The first pair from this group we meet aren't even good at being bad at their jobs. They attempt to shake Cassian down for money, and well, you've seen the show. We're next introduced to Syril, and while he has his own problems that we'll get into later, Syril is honestly the kind of guy the Empire should want to be employing. He's a rule-following nerd who is easy to manipulate and actually seems to really believe in the Empire's heavy-handed approach to bringing order to the galaxy. That assumption is challenged constantly, but Syril is a little slow on the uptake. In fact, he's a bit of an idiot, but he is right about one thing. 2 men were murdered, and that should be a cause for concern. However, Syril's boss would prefer to cover up the murder of 2 men instead of risk hurting his own position. He's selfish, and that selfishness breeds extreme complacency.
When I said bad timing, I wasn't referring to the fact that you spent all night worrying this. I meant that I am on my way this very morning to an Imperial Regional Command review, where I'll be asked to make a report about our crime rates. And the goal of that speech, should you ever be asked to deliver it, is brevity.
It's really important to this show and script that this is how we are introduced to the Empire. Through a lazy bureaucrat too afraid and burdened with his own self-interest to lift a finger in the face of opposition. This sort of attitude is seen throughout the whole show. Imperials, in positions of power, frequently value their own careers and accolades ahead of actually snuffing out rebellions. From the lowly corporate stooges that we meet at the beginning of this story, all the way to the top brass of the Empire. Dictatorships, with their unmitigated control and lack of accountability, naturally attract selfish, prideful idiots who don't need to be skillful or smart, just good at working within a system. These are your brown-nosers, your middlemen, and worse. Not exactly the galaxy's finest, but to the Empire's credit, there are a lot of these types out there. Bullies turned enforcers, willing to throw away any morals or humanity in favor of garnering favor. And the Empire puts these bad actors to work. Need to shoot someone in the street? They've got guys for that. Want to torture someone with the death wails of an extinct species? That's an oddly specific request, but they've got a guy for that as well. Individually, these Imperial stooges aren't anything special. In fact, they're usually portrayed as fairly incompetent. But the problem is, the Empire simply has so many more resources at their disposal compared to any possible opposition. And a dumb adversary is still a dangerous one when they are holding the bigger stick. This is actually how democracy dies. When an uninformed, easily manipulated public mistake a wealth of resources for righteousness. It's the age-old mistake of confusing might with right. And when you're at the top, it's easy to falsely assume you belong there. Authoritarians, oligarchs, and dictators are unsurprisingly arrogant people, and they attract their own in large numbers. It's that arrogance that leaves this sci-fi war machine so exposed. Andor may take a bit of time to set the stage, but by the end of the first 3 episodes of the show, you can already see exactly how this empire will fall. Before you hear Nemik's manifesto on the fragility of tyranny and rebellions built on small acts of defiance, you see those same sorts of acts completely derail Syril's mission to arrest Andor. The people of Ferrix confuse Syril and his soldiers by banging on bits of scrap metal. It's a simple gesture, and dismissed as such by the Corpos, but the banging does give Andor and Luthen advanced warning that they are about to be ambushed.
What does that mean?
Could the rebellion have ended here if these 2 men were captured or killed? Well, the fact that we know where this story is heading says yes. The warning from Ferrix gives Andor's friend, who I never learned the name of, a chance to sabotage the Corpo's cruiser. With a bit of cable and courage, this random blue-collar guy, with a face that looks like a sad space bulldog, managed to save his friend without shooting a blaster or leading some grand insurrection. He simply saw a chance to do something good and took it. Throughout Andor, there are many sad space bulldogs who do the same. Not because it's an easy or safe choice, but because living under the Empire is shown over and over again to never be an option worth considering. The Empire is corrosive. They ruin any planet they occupy, and Tony Gilroy and his writing staff spend hours of television making this point clear from every angle imaginable. On Ferrix and Morlana 1, we see the banality of evil. The Empire outsourcing their control and creating a system rife with bureaucratic corruption. Aldhani introduces the audience to religious persecution. We're told 15,000 pilgrims shrank to a crowd of 60 as a direct result of the Empire's meddling. And Andor's most popular story arc, Narkina 5, spends a few hours exploring the Empire's Panopticon prison system, showcasing how horribly efficient it is at controlling and dehumanizing its captives. You can look at this arc as a blueprint for the entire show. It's the Empire at their most dystopian, evil, corporate, and don't forget arrogant. How do you fight the Empire? Take one look at this prison and ask yourself, how can you not? Andor tries not to. He ignores the call to fight and ends up in prison anyway.
So what did you do?
Nothing.
Not that lately.
Once stuck in this horrible place, the audience gets to watch his character transform into the person he was always meant to become. A leader and a rebel. This arc also happens to have one of my favorite bits of acting in the whole show. And it's not Andy Serkis' speech, even though that's also great. It's what Diego Luna does with his hands. Throughout these episodes, the prisoners are constantly ordered to get on program.
On program.
On program.
Hold your program!
When you're on program, with your fingers interlaced behind your head, you are supposed to be more easy to observe and control. But Andor never fully gets on program. His hands are always sliding further and further towards the sides of his head, like he's ready to turn those hands into fists and start fighting at a moment's notice. This is another one of those small acts of rebellion. It's a minor character choice, but it isn't meaningless either. Andor refusing to fully get on program sets up the rest of the arc beautifully. It tells you exactly what you need to know about Narkina 5 and also the future wars to come. Being a model prisoner is the worst thing you can do in this situation. You must escape this system. It can't be bargained with. Some of these men didn't even commit crimes, and none of them will be released for good behavior. There is only one way out. If you have any final doubts about whether or not it's worth it for these characters to rebel, even if it costs them their lives, consider what happens to the characters who work with the Empire. Nearly every character who chooses to work with the Empire ends up crushed by the machine they help perpetuate. Tim turns in Andor and is shot. Syril is manipulated into helping destroy Gorman and is ultimately shot. These young troopers are intentionally sent into a powder keg without training and are shot by their own. Partagaz shoots himself, rather than spend the rest of his life in prison, which is ultimately where Dedra ends up for failing to capture Luthen alive, even though the Empire wouldn't have known about him at all without her Season 1 investigations. Gilroy's team, arc after arc, with small characters and big ideas, develops the definitive Star Wars text on rebellion.
The pace of repression outstrips our ability to understand it, and that is the real trick of the Imperial thought machine. It's easier to hide behind 40 atrocities than a single incident, but they have a fight on their hands, don't they? Our elemental rights are such a simple thing to hold, they will have to shake the galaxy awfully hard to loosen our grip.
Being a rebel in this show isn't glamorous. It isn't even always that exciting. But it never fails to be compelling. Why should you rebel? Because they cannot win. No matter how many space bulldogs have to die, rebellion is worth it. Even if you can't swim, even if fighting them destroys your family, or your love life, your soul, your chance at any future happiness. Evil cannot win. It mustn't. So ask yourself this, are we still talking about Star Wars?
You know, what, all right, I'll go for it. What does fascism do? It doesn't just destroy the people it comes for first, and the communities and the organizations and the law and the truth and the rest of it. It ultimately comes and destroys its early proponents and its foot soldiers and its underclass, and it destroys because it's all centralized power. It eventually eats its young. There's a scene early on in the first season, if you ever watch it, where he's back in his mother's that apartment, that box he lives in with her, and he's in his childhood room, and he's at his window in the morning, sitting on the side of his bed, And, you know, there's a thing where like there's 30 seconds of sunlight comes through his room and he's waiting for that, like he's waited his whole life. And on his desk are his little action figures. And like that guy, his fantasies could be anything. I don't want to say that I pick him to identify more than anybody else, but maybe you get some idea of how, like, if you're writing well, you feel that way about all of them, right?
Right. I mean, a lot of folks want to kind of, draw parallels between the world we live in now and this show. You're not the type of writer to look at the news and then say, how do I pour that into these characters? That's
not
just...
tonight.
But these stories... Still a little media...
That guy.
Still a little media training left.
Get him out of here.
But these stories are cyclical. These
It's sad but true, yes.